Okay, we'll make a start and then people can join as and when. So thank you very much for joining and welcome to this Raise Farmer the Future webinar, which is focusing on planning for succession, why, when and how. Today we are joined by four fantastic speakers and also we've got Leanne Sutherland from the James Hutton Institute joining us, who is a researcher and expert in succession planning, and she's the director of the Institute's International Land Use Study Centre. So I'm conscious of time and we've got lots to discuss today, so I will hand over straight to Leanne, and she'll be doing a bit of an intro on the topic and introducing all our speakers properly as well. So over to you, Leanne.
Thanks, Natasha. Really pleased to be here today. Just getting my slides up. Can everyone see those?
Yeah.
Nodding and smiling in some form. Well, I'm really pleased to have been invited to chair this session today. This is a topic that is very close to my heart, as you'll see in just a minute. As Natasha said, I'm the director of the International Land Use Study Center, but I was invited to do this, I think, in large part because I've spent the last 25 years studying different aspects of farmer decision-making with a big emphasis on succession, new entrants, and women in agriculture. So I thought I would set the stage today with just a little bit of context. My dad was a farmer. I'm a sixth generation farm kid myself, and he always said, "You mean they pay you to study this stuff? Do people not just know?" But people don't necessarily just know that there is good scientific evidence that younger farmers are more innovative than older farmers. And the is very important because quite often young people, when they're first starting out, maybe don't have the resources that they do a bit later in life. But statistically, they are more likely to diversify. They're more likely to adopt new technologies. And they're very clearly what we need to help take our industry forward. There's also good scientific evidence that successors are more common on profitable farms, and that's partly because young people like to see that there's a viable future for them. If they've seen their parents really struggle financially, then it's hard to think positively about that as a future. But you do, of course, have successors come into a business determined to turn it around, so they can do that as well. Why successors are particularly important for the industry is because there's good evidence that farms with identified successors will invest for 10 years prior to that successor actually becoming fully a part of the decision-making in the business. So they're buying that new technology, they're investing in more training, they're thinking about how can we support an additional income as well as the parents, because quite often, as you know, successors come in before the senior parents are likely to retire. So altogether, succession is an important trigger for transformational change on farms. But we know that succession is messy, and that's why we've got these people on the call today to talk about the different aspects of how we can prepare legally, but also how we communicate well within families. Those of you who are looking closely at the picture on the left will realize it's from the 1980s. And the reason it's from the 80s is because that's me. That's actually me with my 4-H calf. And two of my brothers, I have three, all three of whom have become farmers through some route, and I become an academic. And that kind of career trajectory for women who are raised on farms is not that unusual. Quite often we head off into something related to agriculture, but increasingly we're seeing women become successors, which is exciting. And when it does happen, there's actually really good evidence that the next generation after that will be 50-50, the direction that succession goes. So it's an important time, and it's a difficult thing to get our hands around because we don't actually know how many successors are out there. There's not good statistics on that. But I will tell you that the age of the farmer is really a rubbish statistic. It doesn't tell you very much about who's coming along at all. But the important point I want to make is that this is important to me. It's important to you guys because you've come here today, and it's super important for our industry and the legacy that we want to leave in our families. So with that in mind, I will stop sharing and pass over to the real experts. We have Esther to talk to us. She heads up agriculture at Clark Wilmot. She's a full partner. So we're really pleased to have her here to talk about agricultural property and property litigation and how that works in relation to succession. Go for it, Esther.
Thanks very much, Leanne. I'm going to start by sharing my screen and hopefully it will all work. There we go. Can everyone see my screen? Yep, okay, great. My name is Esther Orford and I'm a partner who specialises in agricultural litigation. And I'm here today to talk about, alongside the new imperative following the October budget, I'm here to talk about a little bit about what can go wrong if there is no clear plan. Starting with one of the key challenges, which is that a successful farming family business has to ensure sufficient formality within that family. When I sit down at my kitchen table with my family, I'm not in business with my husband, so we can deal with the informalities of formal family life and keep our working lives very separate. But with a farming family, the business is interwoven into the fabric of the family, and agreements can be reached around that kitchen table but not documented, and unfortunately sometimes disputes may follow. So today I'm going to highlight some of the common scenarios that can occur, some of the problems, if you like, and then I'm going to run through a little bit of case law to highlight how the court might approach some of these scenarios. So starting with, if there is no clear succession plan in place, and particularly common, no written partnership in place, then significant steps can happen for the business, such as joining a family member as a partner, or moving the farm onto the balance sheet of the farm accounts for good tax reasons, but without any clear terms agreed as to how to resolve differences, then what you need to look at is the Partnership Act, which is an act from the 1890s. And although it's a very workmanlike act, it obviously doesn't cover all modern scenarios that might arise between partners. One key issue is making decisions. And under the Act, if you're going to make a fundamental change, then you need unanimity. And so, of course, if you can't get to that unanimity, you can get stalemate. And in addition to that, if you are seeking to, once you've joined a partner to the business, there's no provision in the partnership agreement about their exit from the business, other than the fact that the partners, if they're unhappy, the common occurrence is that one partner will seek to dissolve the business. So they'll apply for dissolution of the business, which means wind up, which means sale of all of the assets on the open market. And the reason I had to just jump ahead in my points there is because what you commonly expect to be able to do when there's a notice of dissolution is you might think as the continuing partners, well, that's okay, we'll be able to buy out that share. But actually, absent agreement and having no partnership agreement in place, you don't have any right to buy out the exiting partner. And instead, what's going to happen is there's going to be a sale on the open market. One of the other thorny issues is that the farm, when it's sold on the open market, the partnership business may or may not include the farm as an asset of the partnership, because it can be a very thorny issue as to whether or not it's become such an asset. And so what do we know? Well, we know that the default position under the Partnership Act is that the court will most likely seek to sell those farm assets on the open market, because the only truly fair way of establishing value is by going to the open market. So the continuing partners may have a shock to discover that actually, in order to buy back their share, buy back the farm, they need to go along to the auction house and bid alongside everybody else. So there's a significant risk that they might be outbid in that auction process, and they might not be able to buy back their farm or any of their farming assets. They absolutely lose control. So without agreement, it will be a matter of discretion for the court as to whether or not they'll be able to buy back their farm or even partition it into shares. Even if there's a written agreement in place, there can be a further issue as to what is the value of the partnership assets, because it may have been recorded for some time in the accounts at an historic value, which might be well below market value. And so that could be another issue which causes significant issues as to what value do the shares get bought out at. And then the final point on this slide is, even if you don't have an issue around partnership, and you may well be ending up in court over the partnership, then we have another commonly litigated area in farming families, which is known as proprietary estoppel. And that is a doctrine of equitable law, which means that if a promise or representation has been made to commonly one of the farming children that they'll be able to take over the farm one day, and they've relied to their detriment, then the court might order that an equity has arisen such that they're entitled to the farm, and they should be given that entire interest, if it would be unconscionable for the promisor to resile on their promise. So let's have a little look at what the cases have said to us about how the court might approach some of these issues. Starting briefly with Drake versus Harvey, it's a partnership case back in 2011, went to the Court of Appeal, and it surrounded the question of whether or not the assets should be bought out at book or market value. It was going to have a significant issue to the viability of the farm. It was a scenario where sister and brother were in partnership with parents. Sadly, brother died early and prematurely, and therefore his estate was seeking buyout of his share at market value. But the Court of Appeal found in that particular case that actually it wasn't market value that applied, it was the historic book values, because the partnership agreement that was in place in that case was sufficiently clear, albeit that it had to go all the way to the Court of Appeal to get that clarity. It was sufficiently clear that the fundamental principle of fairness for that agreement was to ensure viability of the farm being able to continue, and so book value was ordered. We roll on a few years to Ham versus Ham. In that case, mother and father and son were in partnership, but again, they have a falling out. And in that case, the court said, yes, we have got a partnership agreement and we have a buyout clause. So far, so good. But in that case, the court said that, in fact, the partnership agreement envisaged that the buyout would be as if the farm was being sold on the open market. So therefore, open market values applied, which was potentially a significant windfall for son and a very potential disbenefit for the parents. That same family ended up in court a few years later as to whether or not the farm was in fact an asset of the partnership. And so then that was litigated. In that case, the farm business that had the farm accounts had included the farm on the balance sheet for a period from 1997 to 2004. But then in 2004, mum and dad had taken the farm off the balance sheet and taken it out. And so they said, no, it's not an asset of the partnership. Son said, yes, it is, because that's an implicit intention that the farm was an asset of the partnership. The court disagreed and said, no, the accounts are not always in the only place to look. In fact, what the most important thing is to look at the intention of the parties and understand really what was meant. And it wasn't implicit by the farm having been on the partnership accounts, even for a significant period of time, that it was a farm asset. Moving on to a more recent case of Cobden and Cobden. That was a case of two brothers, and one brother brought a claim before the court on the basis that he should be entitled to buy out his brother under something called a sire's order. And the court held in his favour on the basis that those two brothers had had various discussions about one brother buying the other out, and it would have been unconscionable for that not to have happened. So although we've always historically thought that sire's orders are very difficult to get, and you're always at risk in terms of being able to buy out if you haven't got a provision in your partnership agreement to allow you to do so, which they didn't in that case. But this may have developed the law a little bit into the world of estoppel and equities. So we watch that space, which brings me on to equities and proprietary estoppel. Davies and Davies is one of the classic farming cases known as the case of the Cinderella cowgirl. In that case, Elian Davies farmed for 25 years on her parents' farm. She says, subject to the promise that she would always inherit the farm. She referred to her unimaginable toil for all of that period, pitchfork in hand, sisters out socialising, and her very much to her detriment working and slaving away on the farm. The courts agreed that she did have an estoppel, and she was awarded in the end a sum of £500,000 that was downgraded from 1.3 million because she had made some other decisions which didn't show absolute commitment to the farm. That's then followed by Guest and Guest, which has been a landmark case which my firm acted on. I acted on this case. It went to the Supreme Court, and it was all about how do you craft that equity. If the promise has been made, and the promise has been made that the whole farm will be awarded, will be passed down, how does the court try and grapple with all the competing interests? Because in that case, parents were still alive. And they said that the starting point is you do look at that promise, and if possible, you award the promise. So if the whole farm was promised, then that's the starting point, unless there is some other factors that make that totally unconscionable in the circumstances. And there's been a flurry of case law since Guest and Guest. One of the most recent being Winter and Winter, that's also gone to the Court of Appeal. And in that case, it was 3 brothers, 2 who were left out of the will by father. They were all in partnership together, and the 2 brothers that were claiming a proprietary estoppel had already benefited significantly in the tunes of several million under the partnership. But the court found they had still made life-altering decisions by giving up other careers, and they didn't need to establish that they had a financial loss, even though on the evidence it looked like they actually did better by staying in the farm financially. It was the court said, if you're going to make those life-altering decisions and you're going to devote yourself to the farm, then you should be awarded, in that case, but there had been a promise and they were awarded 1/3 share of the farm. So what do all of these cases have in common? Well, I mean, I'm kind of doing myself out of a job, but they do all have significant costs. So they all do need to be avoided. Litigation should be avoided at all costs. And so that's why we're all here today, to talk about why, it's so important, these topics today, to try and avoid these cases. I have got here on this next slide, some examples of some of the topics you need to talk about when you're crafting the agreements that will hopefully avoid these issues. But I'm conscious that I don't want to take up too much time, because we've got to stick to our time limits, and I think I'm probably close to mine. So on that, I'm going to stop and pass over to the next speaker.
Well, thank you so much, Esther. That was super informative. Scary on one hand about what can happen, because I don't even want to think about what the legal fees associated with those court cases have been, but also really good warnings to us about why it's important to dig in and have these conversations. And that leads us on to Heather Wildman. She's a professional communicator. She's got a lot of coalface experience, or farm-face barn experience, I suppose. She was raised on a family farm in the Lake District. She's been working on a farm in Scotland for the last 20 years, and she's trained as a professional facilitator, communicator, and she's going to talk to us about how we can have these conversations. Over to you, Heather.
Thank you, Leanne. Thank you for the opportunity. And I guess my whole role and legacy is to try and help families avoid the situation that Esther has just portrayed. And for me, a lot of people defer talking about succession because they're terrified of the 6 Ds. They don't want to preempt death, disability, disease, disaster, divorce, disagreements, or debt. But one way or another, the business, the farm, the business is all going to transition. And, the only certainty we all have in life is that we are going to die. Thankfully, we don't know when, we don't know how, and we don't know in what order. And that's why I really push to get more families talking about and de-risking their business. So what is your vision? What is your dream? Where are you now as a family business? Where do you want to be, and how are you going to get there? And for me, it's regardless of what generation you are in the business. A lot of people are waiting for, oh, well, if I'm the elder generation, I don't want to preempt and rush the children to come back to the farm. They've got good careers, they're out doing other things, and we know farming's hard. So the elder generation maybe don't want to bring it up. The incoming new generation, they often don't want to bring it up because they don't want to feel greedy, grabby, and they don't want to talk about death. But ultimately, whoever you are, wherever you are that's on this call, it is your job to bring it up. And, it's where are you, where do you want to be, and how are you going to get there? Do you love the farm? Is it something that's passionate and a buzz, that's something that you really, really want to do? Or actually don't? And be honest about that, because so often we're afraid of upsetting and offending people. And also sometimes, because of our experiences and our fears, I get really frustrated at the moment about the press and the industry. It's so negative. Everything is doom, doom, doom. There's no future in farming. There's no future in agriculture. I firmly disagree. And I think, if you are disillusioned, you are tired, you are demotivated, but you've got another generation that's coming in that is enthusiastic and excited about it, give them a chance. But you have to be really honest about the financials and everything that's there. So think about where you want to be. The other thing with succession and handing over the business, transition it, financial independence is liberating. So if a generation that is exiting the business can possibly be financially independent, it takes a lot of pressure off. So we need to think where we want to be. We need to write it down. We need to verbalize it. We need to communicate it. And then we need to have the right team around us, which today you're going to see some of the key professionals that you need with you to help you deliver a successful succession model. So simple conversations, and you cannot start this soon enough. When you're getting married, when you've got children, when you're coming into a business, when you're leaving school, when you're leaving university, these are all times to be talking about this and just have fun with it. It does not have to be horrible. So many succession transitions happen beautifully. They do not have to be a nightmare. And that's what another thing I want to be putting out there. Don't be afraid of it. But if you do get kicked back, don't give up. Keep pushing in, because sometimes people aren't just ready for it. So do you know what you want to have? Do you know what you want to do? Do you know where you want to be? Do you know what you want to achieve? Do you know where you want to live? Do you know how you want to spend your time? I want to work till the day I die. I'm a farmer. I actually only want to work 5 days a week. I want to finish at 5 o'clock. I want to have hobbies. I want to have interests. I want to live in the town. I want to live in the big house. This is my aspiration of income and earning. These are all things you should be talking about before you bring anyone into the business, because this is what fallouts happen about. Disagreements, assuming what is a good income and a good lifestyle for one is what a next generation wants. So by being open and honest about this and have some fun with it, and give yourself some time. So, do you know what you want? And are you ready to make the change? Because you will have to own this. Nobody has your best interest at heart. Nobody will do this for you. You will have to push, you will have to nag, you will have to get them to the table, you'll have to get them to the accountants, get them to the bank, get them to the solicitor. You'll have to nag the solicitor, accountant and bank, sorry ladies, and chase them up and give them deadlines as well. You will have to read the paperwork, you will have to check the paperwork, and then most of all, please sign it and return it. But, and have a timeline in place, because the more I've been involved in this, and I have no legal training whatsoever, I just get people talking. And, the more people talk about it, you realize it is quite complicated. And for every pro, there's a con. So it's really important that you put as much out on the table and then weigh up the right solution for you and your family. Because it might be the best thing to do is to work together for the next 10 years, buy another business, buy another farm, pay it all off, and then you'll have more together to split. But it might be that there's just no way we can do that we need to split sooner than later because of mental and maybe physical health traits and things as well. But you need to have timeframes in mind, because sometimes it can be quite simple, quite straightforward. And if we have a time frame and we have deadlines, we actually meet it. But other times, because of ownership structures, tax years and different things, it can actually take longer than you think. So for me, again, the sooner you start, the better. Do you have an exit plan? Do you have a retirement plan? How old are you? Are you 30, 40, 50, 60, 80, 90? On the ruler of life, on average, we live to about 78, 80. So if you think where you are in the ruler of life, how long have you got of your career? And when do you aspire to retire, if you're going to retire? But let's be honest, you can't do what you can do at 80 as you could when you were 30 or 40. Will you be financially independent when you retire, or will you expect that the next generation may be gifted the business, but as part of that, they need to keep you into retirement? Or will they need to buy in and buy you out of the business? So you need to do your numbers. You cannot do your succession plan until you know where you are, what the value, what the assets and what the debts are, and also who is actually still involved in the business as well. And then you will have to speak to the children and the family. Some people, we have a regular family summit on a Sunday afternoon, or we book a hotel, a venue, and we make a social out of it. For some people, it is literally going 70 miles an hour down the dual carriageway with the central locking on because nobody can get out. Whatever works for you, don't give up and write it down and keep persisting with it. When I have a family meeting, I want to know who's involved in the family. So I write everything down. Is auntie, uncle, granda, granny? Has there been a death? You know, how did we actually get the business? How did we get where we are today? And who is expecting to be part of the legacy? The next thing I want to know is, what is the legacy? What are all the assets? What value do we have in the business? And I can honestly say, when I start doing this, there is oxygen comes in the room, because often we forget what we've got. We all hear about the negative. Then I want to put the market values, and these are just fag packet market values. So of all the fixed assets we've got, the land, the farm and everything, how much are they worth? The movable, the sheep, the cattle, the poultry, the flamingos, whatever it is, what are they worth? Also, we want the debt in there as well. Have we got HP? Have we got loans? Then have we got any other properties on the farm? What are they worth? And you mustn't forget the savings, the pensions, all these other things that you've maybe got squiddled away that we forget. These are really, really important. You put these on the paper. And then we want to think, how are we going to share it? If we've got 3 children, like the example, do we split it equally between the 3, which might be absolutely fine, as long as the farming child knows. And if that happens, I always say, value the farm from the day they come in, and then they know what they've potentially got to pay out. But it may be, when you look at this, you think, right, well, 1 or 2 children are going to farm, and we're going to leave the house or a barn conversion to the other children and some cash and savings. But you've really got to think this through, because then there's also the care home costs and everything else through. But having this, you can play about with it and get the children to talk about it. The other team are going to talk more about these, but it's so important. But for me, a how-to manual is the kindest thing you can give your family. Making sure when you die, everybody knows where your will is, your power of attorney, where the deeds are, where the property ownerships are, the mortgage information, the bank account, where all the passwords are, what are the login details, who are all the social media accounts, your savings, your debt, and also the stopcock, the meters, the drains. Really, really important that even if you can't get the family discussion, that is too hard, start building up your how-to manual, even for our own domestic arrangements. And I think I'll stop there, because I think I've probably done my time.
That's terrific there. Thanks so much. A lot of really great information there. I think those slides are going to be available later. The whole webinar will be online. Is that correct, Natasha? So don't worry if you didn't get all of them noted down. I just highly recommend getting someone like Heather involved. If you have great communication in your family, then you can work from the information that she's given you. But if, like most families, it's not always that straightforward, I suspect it's a whole lot cheaper to pay someone like Heather now than it is to pay someone like Esther later. Right? Not that you're not going to need to get Esther involved, but you can see Esther nodding and smiling. These conversations, even if you have to pay a facilitator, are so going to save you money in the long term and save your family connections as well. So we're going to head on next to Susie Russell. Susie works with CSAs. She's part of a CSA network, and she's going to talk about different things that you can do with your farm business, but she's going to talk more about the facilitation piece too, I think. Go for it, Susie.
Thank you. Let me just start it. Okay, can everyone see that? I think so. Okay, great. Yeah, so it's a bit different from everyone else. I work for the Community Supported Agriculture Network. We're a network of about 200 very, very small farms across the UK, mostly horticultural. But this piece of work actually was a partnership piece of work with 4 partners. So there was us, Ecological Land Co-op, Stir to Action and Shared Assets. And it was, to give a bit of context, it was around the time when lump sum payments came out. There was a desire. We work a lot with new entrant farmers who don't come with family farms or inherited land, and so we're interested in trying in like whether the lump sum payments were going to mean a lot of land moved out of farmland. I guess there are other things pushing at that too, like BNG and carbon credits, which are meaning that farmland is getting used for things that aren't food production. So it was a 2-year project. We started off slightly erroneously looking at whether communities could take on family farms when there wasn't an obvious successor. So again, we were really looking a lot at farms where there wasn't necessarily a successor, but some where there were. And then in the second year, we sort of ended up concentrating on the idea of land trusts as a vehicle for maintaining land in food production, and the potential for those trusts to offer more people access to that land. And we had 4 streams in that work: finance, housing, community buyouts, and collective enterprise. I guess the biggest learning from the first phase, we talked to 5 farmers farmers and landowners of really different size, from a huge estate in Scotland to a small family farm of about 30 acres in Dorset. And the biggest learning was just that the sort of social, familial, emotional, technical, and cultural considerations can act as really huge barriers to land passing on, and that they all need to be taken into account. So yeah, things like wanting your land to be stewarded the way you've stewarded it, feeling guilty, whatever you do, for the next generation if you give up your land, or if you don't, or even if you don't have a next generation, that you feel bad because it's been in your family for generations and now it's not going to be. Cultural stuff which can push either way. I want to give up land because I don't feel it's fair, or I don't want to give it up. It's part of our sort of culture. Tax and the money you pay trying to do anything different with your farm. And then probably the strongest, like the huge emotional tie to a piece of land, the sense of a woman recently, a female farmer, described it to me as she'd been working in non-farming jobs, and then became a farmer, had a family history of farming, and said, when you leave a job, you're not attached to the office you work in, but when you leave land, you're massively attached to it. And that sort of sense of belonging and place is really hard to work out in succession. So I won't go through these, but those were the 5 farms in phase 1. And then the 2 strands of work that we worked on were the community buyouts with these 12 farms, and collective enterprise with another 11 farms, some of whom crossed over. So I'll start by talking a bit about community buyouts. So these were farms which either were thinking about a community buyout or had been bought out. There were different models and reasons for the buyouts, and the formats, they either were being put into trust, or they were becoming community benefit societies, which allows for a share offer. And then we also looked at the role of community land trusts, which in England are currently entirely housing based, but in other countries do include food production, and whether there is some work going on looking at whether there could be agricultural land trusts which sort of work in the same way, and what that would entail, and whether that might mean that the housing issue, so a lot of we've come across a fair number of retiring farmers who want to do something different with their land, but also want to stay on the land. And I think that's an issue anyway in succession. So whether more housing done in a sensitive way might mean that the existing farmers could stay on the land, but also welcome new people. And then the reasons for buyouts were saving the family farm, financial reasons, keeping land in food production in perpetuity, having control of local food, and sort of divestment of land that had been gained in ways that those families didn't feel they wanted. One of the participants, you'll probably know her, Charlotte from Ford Hall Farms, the first community bought out farm, said everyone wants to have a positive impact, but they don't know how to do it. And so when they launched their community share scheme, that was really what they felt, that the people who were buying shares, the 8,000 shareholders, desperately wanted to have a positive impact in farming, but didn't actually want to farm. And then this is a quote from it's a sort of a quote from Stockwood Community Benefit Society. So in both their cases, it was to save the family farm, and the family are still farming the land as tenants with, in Ford Hall's case, a 100-year lease. The farm income for Stockwood isn't a big percentage of the total income. They've also got ground source heat and a business park. But for them, the buyout solved wanting to keep farming and a succession problem. And for them, the CBS made keeping the farm in the family viable, where a mortgage wouldn't have been an option. It was the difference of 3% in the interest payments. It also meant that they had a connection with their members. So for them, it's been really beneficial. So for the buyouts, the sort of large shareholder base and the community embedded nature has reportedly generated resilience, and so then is more able to provide local food forever, to safeguard against the sale of farmland into non-farming, and reverse the trend of increasing food imports and keep food British. The sort of common themes in the buyouts were that there was always a pioneer, one or two people who were passionate, and that has its own succession problems, whether or not they're part of a family or part of a sort of other organisation like a KIC, an interested community. When those pioneers want to retire, it's hard. But community ownership does mean that people can plan long term and know they're going to stay on the land into the future. And they were really keen to share and gift combined knowledge. So if anyone on this webinar wanted to find out more, they're very happy to talk. And then the collective enterprise, people had gone in. So collective enterprise stacking. We talk about collective enterprise as one piece of land hosting different businesses rather than diverse income streams all under the same business. They're both called enterprise stacking in different places. So we chose collective enterprise to be lots of different businesses. People had gone into it for financial viability reasons and ethical, philosophical reasons. Some people wanted to build a circular economy and sort of used farm waste, like bits of land that weren't being used, or I don't know, products that came from, like woodland products that came from existing hedging or woodland that weren't being used. And they could offer additional finance. And these are a couple of quotes from people who are doing collective enterprise. If you looked at each business on its own, you might say you get a better return from doing something else. But when you add them together, there's resilience to the whole estate you can't get alone. And then I think for me, it's realizing we're all trying to do something amazing. We're having a discussion around this sort of concept, but there's no one size fits all. And these are some of the farms that are doing collective enterprise. So there's Pitch Up, which is Balcaskey Estate in Scotland, and Kingsclear in the southwest, but it was southwest is also now there are 4 more farms who've joined Pitch Up. It's sort of inviting enterprises onto your land. That's Stockswood Community Benefit Society, who, as well as being a bought out farm, are also doing a variety of different things on their land. And similarly, Ford Hall, there in the bottom right hand corner, Wakelands in Suffolk, and Farm Ed in the Cotswolds. The benefits, multiple businesses offer more support. Each brings their own network, knowledge, audience. The social benefits are significant, although little understood. The model appears to increase revenue streams and de-risk, although there definitely needs to be more work on proving or being really clear about that. Personal resilience is improved, it can strengthen local economies, increases employment, and there can be real benefits from enterprises sharing resources. Challenges for both community buyouts and collective enterprise across the farming world, same challenges: housing, wages, rising costs, land access and training. And then more specific to these things, so sort of for the collective enterprise, management of suddenly a group of different businesses and people on your land. Lack of financial support and research into both models and how they work, and kind of, the development of trust, particularly with collective enterprise, actually having trust between the people coming onto the land and the landowner or existing farmer is crucial. Passion for the buyouts, having to suddenly collaboratively work when you haven't done that before. New entrants coming onto your land with ideas, but how do you know they know how to make it work? And then sort of lack of training for new entrants. That should say informed, not infirm. Lack of informed.
This is great, Susie. Can we? We're going to need to move on to the next one quite shortly. So if I can.
Okay, sorry, I'm nearly done.
Great.
Yeah, and just that they're very bespoke. And then final thoughts. There's real need for more research on this. Help on governance and agreements. Scotland's sort of further along. These models need sort of getting out there so people know they exist. And just to say, in the collective enterprise, there's a Land Match England service being developed, which should help with some of it. That's the end. Thank you.
That's terrific. Thank you, Susie. Sorry to rush you, but we do want to have some time for questions at the end. So if people would notice at the bottom of your screen, just provided the share button, there's a Q&A. And you should be able to put some comments in there or into the chat, and Natasha will track those for us so that we can have some questions of our panelists at the end. I'm going to shift on to our final speaker, Samantha Doherty. She is an accountant, but a very interesting accountant. I know we don't always hear those things, but she knows all kinds of tips and tricks for how to sort out the logistics of what works in terms of tax. Inheritance tax has been in the news an awful lot lately for very good reasons, so I'm sure she has some tips on that, but there was always going to be an issue for farms passing between generations and how you manage that. So over to you, Samantha.
Yeah. So I'm a lawyer at the Tax and Succession Department in Frings, one of the partners there. But yes, in terms of the budget, by now everybody will be au fait with the changes to APR and BPR that came about by the Chancellor in the budget. Obviously, the main headline being that pre-April 2026, you get 100% relief on APR and BPR assets. Post-April 2026, it's only the first £1 million that will get 100% relief, and that's combined. You don't get £1 million for APR and £1 million for BPR, it's combined. And thereafter, everything will be charged at a eligible rate of 50%, so effectively 20% tax, everything over the £1 million. So I've done a quick case study. As you can see, I've been very inventive with my name. It's just a quick case study just to try and give you a bit of an illustration of what that actually means. So we've got Mr. Farmer. He owns the entire farm and enterprise in his sole name. He's operating as a sole trader. He's married with 2 children. One of the children works on the farm, the other has moved away. And we're saying the farm is worth approximately £10 million. Now, pre-April 2026, on the facts of this farm, no inheritance tax would have been payable on his death, passing it down to the next generation. Post-April 2026, with no planning, the IHT bill on Mr. and Mrs. Farmer's deaths would be 1.67 million. So significant, really significant for a lot of the farmers out there. You can pay over a 10-year period. There's no interest paying over a 10-year period. So you can pay by 10 yearly instalments, but still a lot of farms out there would never be able to afford to pay that sort of inheritance tax. So how has this affected succession planning going forward for farmers? The biggest thing really is the threat of the tax has now brought the planning to the forefront of farmers' minds. Whereas before, pre-budget, farm could be passed on without there being any tax consequences, it was quite easy to ignore the succession planning that was needed, that we've all spoken about. And you knew that it was going to be passed on somehow, and there wouldn't be any tax consequence from it. Now we've got exactly the same problems with succession as we had previously, but just the added problem of if we don't deal with this during lifetime, there is potentially a massive inheritance tax bill at the end of it. So things that we can now look at and we can do. Wills is one of the big things. So in my example of Mr. and Mrs. Farmer, I'm assuming that they have simple wills, leaving everything to each other. If they just change that and they left their £1 million that they can get APR and BPR free to the next generation or to a trust, depending on whether they know who the next generation is going to be at that point, then they can get £2 million inheritance tax free, which will be a saving of inheritance tax of £200,000. So quite a simple thing to change, but gives quite a significant outcome for them. Another thing that they can look at doing is gifts during lifetime. Now, this all falls very nicely with the succession planning in a total. Who is the next generation that are going to be farming? How can we incentivize them to carry on farming, to take over the farm? Making gifts of some of the partnership land, if it was held in a partnership, some of the land, you get capital gains tax holdover relief on this, so there isn't a tax on making the gift. Provided you survive 7 years from making the gift, it's outside of your estate from an inheritance tax point of view. Now, something that you've really got to be aware of and you've got to be careful of is making the gift, but reserving some form of benefit. So you've got to be sure that you don't need that gift that you are making. Now, with partnerships, for example, it's simpler. You can say the children are involved in the partnership. They get 5% of profit. You suddenly give them some of the capital and their profit share goes up with it. Then you haven't reserved the benefit. But you have got to be really careful that the gift is a full gift and it hasn't reserved a benefit. Another thing that's probably going to come into play a lot more is trusts. If you aren't sure as to who you want to gift the asset to, which next generation you want to gift the asset to, or there's potentially issues within that generation, then gifting the assets into trust might be a good opportunity or a good positive thing to do. If you gift before April 2026, there's no tax consequences of gifting assets into trust. Same as before, you've got to survive the 7 years for it to be outside of your estate. The negative to gifting into trust is that it is subject to 10 yearly charges, which would be 3% of the value over and above £1 million. But that might be a figure that the farm could sustain, because once again, you can pay that over 10 years. Another thing, obviously, is looking at the business structure of the farms. Can we incorporate it in a partnership? What do we do to make sure this can go down to the next generation, but potentially still retain some control in those gifts? Historically, you'd wait until you passed away because farmers like the control. If you look at the partnerships, if you look at farming business structures, incorporating farms, then you can retain that control that you want to have, but also be able to pass some of that wealth down to the next generation. And as I said, incentivize them to be involved in the farm, to push this farming business forward. With passing assets on, you probably want the next generation to look at pre and post nuptial agreements, and that is going to be something that's going to become more and more relevant. If we're going to give the assets down to the younger generations, we want to make sure that it is protected the best that we possibly can, to ensure that it's not going to pass in the wrong direction or start getting broken up due to arguments or divorces, basically, within these younger generations. And then the final thing really to be looking at is life insurances. So if we're making gifts, we can insure that gift in case we don't survive that 7-year period. Or looking at getting life insurances to see whether or not we can insure for a death on the farm to make sure the inheritance tax is covered. Basically, we just want to make sure that as best we can, we are covering the inheritance tax and it isn't a problem for the succession plan of the farm. But as I said, one of the biggest things with this, same problems exist as they did before with succession planning. It's just now you've got the extra problem of tax. What you shouldn't be doing is making any rash decisions that you wouldn't have made before the budget. So don't suddenly start giving away all your assets or gifting it everywhere that you would never have contemplated before. You still need to make sure that you have a viable business that is able to be succeeded to, and you don't want to make any rash decisions which would stop that from happening. But it is something that now, as I said, there is a tax bill, there is something to be paid, and therefore people should really start considering what they need.
That is very efficient.
I needed to be.
Thank you so much, Samantha. Very efficient, terrific information coming through there. Can I clarify about you were very clear about the gift and how it's important the gift is actually a gift. So that means you can't give your house, for instance, to your child if you're still living in it.
No, 100% definitely not. You, unless your child is living with you in that house, and there might be an argument to be able to give 50% to your child because they're currently living there with you. But it has to be gone as such. You can't reserve that benefit. So if you go, oh, I give you that farmland, but I'm going to carry on farming it and receiving all the income from it, HMRC are never going to accept that's a gift. They're going to say, no, you've reserved the benefit, that gift is still within your remit. So you have got to be really careful when you're making the gifts that you haven't reserved any benefit in it.
That is super helpful. Thank you, Samantha. So we have had some questions come up in the Q&A. Okay, one of them disappeared. It was.
I answered it typing, but yeah, you could read out the answer. I typed it. Sorry.
Okay, I can only see Bibi Raknovici's question. I can't see the one that was there originally. Do you have it, or can you paraphrase it in case one of the other panelists would like to comment on it?
Sure. Susan Hawes said, I'm keen to understand options for retirement of a landowner farmer who doesn't have any family successor. Community land trust was interesting, but are there other ways of reducing workload and releasing equity to fund retirement, perhaps through share farming, enterprise stacking, or other models? I've just said CLTs aren't yet working for farmland, but we're hoping we can change that. Share farming is a succession option for those with those successors. I've terrible typos, apologies. Happens a lot in Ireland. The Irish Land Match Service basically facilitates this, so it would be a place to look. Share farming can work, but like collective enterprise, needs a really clear way of establishing trust, ensuring both partners feel happy and won't lose out on the time and energy they've invested if it doesn't work out. What Ford, Horn and Stockwood, and most recently Babinswood, my typing is awful, apologies, have done or are doing is selling the farm to the community via community shares, but continuing to farm it as a tenant. And in those cases, the board of the CBS, which is the legal structure you need in order to launch community shares, has certain places on it for family members, which ensures that the family continue to have a say in how the farm is run and can stay farming it. So, I mean, that would be Stockswood or Ford Hall would be the models to look at if you're interested in that. So it's essentially a way of selling the farm and staying on the farm and getting some money back. I hope that makes sense.
That's great. I'm wondering if some of the other panelists want to come in on retirement options. So this, I think, is about securing an income for the retiring couples. They still have a place to stay. They still have an income when the next generation kind of takes over. So the senior farmers actually step out of the farm altogether and just continue to farm until death, dropping in harness. What are the options that we're looking at there?
I was just going to add, Leanne, about the classic tenants model. You could let to a tenant in a more traditional sense, and certainly I know that the Tenant Farmers Association are lobbying the government. That's one of the things they're trying to get changed with the budget, that there may be tax breaks for longer tenancies. So that's the sort of more traditional route.
Is there a mortgage option where you can sell the farm to your kids essentially and then just withdraw the interest on the mortgage and then gift it? Would that work?
Is that one for Samantha?
I suspect so, yes.
I think this question didn't have any successors, didn't they? I think that was their problem, that they didn't have successors that they wanted to give it to.
Yes.
I mean, release would probably be available on a property as equity release is available on most properties. Whether they'd want to go down that route or not, I don't know. But they were looking at the succession of this farm with no next generation to take over and what projects there were available to be able to give them that succession.
Good stuff. Well, I can say that there are land matching services available throughout the UK. There's a good one in Scotland. Northern Ireland has one. There's one in Wales. Actually, England's a bit behind the curve. They are trying to set one up, and they had a temporary one back kind of 2015, 2017, supported by the Prince's Trust that hasn't kind of carried on, but there's been a lot of kind of regional motions towards that. So there are land matching service opportunities out there. Okay. So I'll stop talking before we run out of time. My husband is the sole landowner, but we are in a joint business partnership. Can he give me a share or the land so I can use my £1 million relief?
The simple answer is yes. But it would be interesting to see what the business partnership is, because it would probably be done via the partnership, via capital accounts on the partnership, working out who owns what part of the capital accounts. It doesn't necessarily need the legal transfer of the land into both of your names, because legal ownership and beneficial ownership are different. But yes, it would make sense in terms of married couples. If the land is all in one person's name, or the capital is all in one person's name, sharing it between the two of you to make sure you can both get your £1 million. Would make sense.
That's great. Another one for you, Samantha. Can you elaborate on the IHT impact of incorporation?
So the IHT benefits of an incorporation is to be able to share the wealth between different generations of your family, but potentially restrict what they can do. So you can have alphabet shares, A, B, and C shares. You could give people C shares that might have a capital value, but they won't be having voting rights. They won't be able to determine what happens on the farm. But by giving away the capital values 5 to 7 years, as I said, you start getting into avoiding or the inheritance tax not being part of you, or the asset not being part of your estate from an inheritance tax point of view. But the idea behind the incorporation of it is to give you the ABC shares and give you the ability to be able to give capital away without the control element being lost necessarily. Still working on making sure you don't fall foul of the gift of reservation of benefit rules.
Thanks, Samantha. What are the A and B shares? I'm gathering the C shares are capital.
Oh no, it's just literally, it's just what you call the shares. You can delegate what an A share is, you can delegate what a B share is. So you might say the A shares are entitled to dividends of X amount, the B shares are entitled to dividends of X amount, and the C shares are entitled to dividends of whatever. It's just a different class of shares, and they're all entitled to different rights, and you can set out what those rights are. It can go all the way through to D, E, F. It depends on the corporate structure. But yeah, it's just different designations of shares.
Okay, so you can identify 2 of your kids, they've been working on the farm, they have voting rights on deciding how you actually manage the farm, whereas another child maybe hasn't been involved, but that child has access to the capital, but doesn't actually get a vote in whether we put the new barn.
Affect how the farm is run. They can't give those shares to someone outside of the family necessarily. You've got an element of control. You're able to benefit everybody within reason, and keep the control within the farming family as such.
Okay. So what's one on characteristics of new entrants that I think maybe answered already. I'm not sure. I've done a lot of work on new entrants. New entrants typically own their farms, but they're much smaller farms because they've had to borrow that money or earn that money elsewhere. So unless you're James Dyson, chances are that makes for a small farm. They do tend to be more innovative. They do tend to be more diverse, but they are actually less likely to be financially viable because you really struggle without inheriting the resources of a farm in some form to be able to establish a viable entity. Also less likely to have successors because they tend to buy their farms later in life, less chance to socialize their kids into becoming farmers behind them. But these are all kind of percentages. You get exceptions all over the place. Are there any other questions that we need to answer? I'm conscious we're just coming to the end of our time. This has been a fascinating session for me. I've really enjoyed having this kind of coalface expertise from the legal field, from people who are out talking to farmers and doing this kind of facilitation. I'm going to say something unpopular, which is that I think the inheritance tax, while it is traumatic and awful, does have the silver lining that it's getting farm families talking. And in the long run, that might actually save you more money than you risk losing an inheritance tax. And it may actually be worth it if it means that your family's still talking to each other after you're gone. You know, I've been through a family situation where my cousin lost my grandparents' family farm, 7 generations in the family in a divorce because they weren't set up. I saw my aunts and uncles not talk to each other for years because there was a divorce earlier and they didn't talk about how the will would change. The will was changed and we didn't discover until after grandpa died. So these are things you absolutely need to invest in for your family as well as for your farm's future. So I know that this seminar is going to be available online and there will be slides available too, I believe. Am I making false promises, Natasha? These will be out there. Please do have these conversations and tune in again.
I was just going to say, as long as all the speakers are happy for the slides to be shared, we can share them to people who've signed up. That's fine.
Yeah, I think it's important enough to all of us to be here and to have shared these slides with you, and we are quite happy to be of assistance. So I'll pass it back to you, to Natasha.
Yeah, no, thank you, everybody. Yeah, thanks, Leanne, for chairing. So it's been brilliant. And Esther, Heather, Susie, and Samantha, thanks for being so generous with your time and sharing a little bit of your expertise with everybody today. So that's 2 o'clock finish, so bang on time. And thanks everyone for joining.